So you're here for behavior intervention plans. And I just wanted to say, maybe one or two of you were here for our previous training on positive behavior support theory. That was a training we did last week. And it actually is what's behind the concept of BIPs. So if you did not go to that training, I would urge you to listen to it when you get a chance. But that would be a good thing for you to do, is to go back and look at that, because it goes much more deeply into the theory behind behavior intervention plans. While we get started, I must tell you that we're Matrix Parent Network. Our mission is to empower families of children with special needs to successfully understand and access the systems that serve them. And of course, special education is one of those systems. We want you to become successful advocates and role models for your children. And the important point is here that we want you to become successful advocates. We don't feel like we are here to advocate for you, but rather to train you as advocates. We do have to let you know we are not attorneys, we're not advocates, and we're not school psychologists. So who are we and who are you? My name is Margaret, and I'm a parent advisor here at Matrix. I've been in the position for 9 years, I believe, and I really enjoy working here. I came to Matrix when my kids started having a lot of difficulties in school. I am very grateful that with Matrix's help, we got them through high school. They're both graduated from high school and are on their own at this point. So I have not had the difficult experience that many of you have gone through this past year with having kids learning at home. My co-presenter this morning is David, and I'll let David say a couple of words about himself before we get started.
Okay, thank you, Margaret, and welcome everyone. My name is David, and I've been a parent advisor with Matrix for about 4 months. I'm a retired special education school district director, and I worked in special education for many years, and I worked in the behavior field for many years. I also have a lovely, recently turned 16-year-old granddaughter with autism, and who I'm very close to, and that is who I am. So thank you, Margaret.
So what do we hope you learned today? Well, the who, what, when, where, and how of behavior intervention plans, how to develop and evaluate a behavior intervention plan, and how to be a more informed member of your child's IEP team. So at this point, we're going to talk about problem behaviors, and I think David's going to talk about this.
All right, so let's talk about some of the behaviors that we might be looking at when we're talking about behaviors. So some of the examples of them could be poor attendance, a child refusing to go to school or having some anxiety around going to school, off task, not paying attention, argumentative verbal threats, possibly leaving the classroom without permission, hands in pants. The main part of this, or the main point of this, is that it's any behavior getting in the way of learning. So I do want to make a point that if a behavior is not getting in the way of learning, then that may not be something we choose. I'll give you an example of that. I taught for many years at a California State University campus, and many times I'd have a student say, "Do you mind if I doodle when I'm taking notes?" And I would say, "Of course not." And they would say, "But other lecturers say that they have a problem with me. They don't think I'm paying attention." So that's an example of behavior not getting in the way of learning. So it's important to differentiate between problem behaviors and those which are just not interfering with behavior. So how does behavior get in the way of learning? So it could be that a student's unavailable for instruction, if they're talking out in class or not able to sit in their seat, and they're just not able to attend, and that's an issue. It could be that a student is disrupting others in talking or doing something that's annoying and disrupting to others. Could be something that requires full adult attention. So the adult in the room or the adults in the room are unable to provide appropriate instruction for kids. Or it could be just the fact that there's a reduced work production, if there's a refusal to complete assignments, or if the behaviors are getting in the way of completing those assignments, that's an issue. Okay, and Margaret, I'll hand it back to you.
So, so how do you address problem behavior in the behavior intervention plan? The first thing you do, of course, is you bring your concerns to the IEP team. Usually you would ask for a meeting. And so you may have an IEP meeting, an IEP for your child that does not address behavior. And then during the course of the year, some behavior problems crop up. At that point, you can call for an IEP meeting. You remember that, you just write a letter or email to your case manager and say, I'd like to have an IEP meeting. And within 30 days, one should be scheduled. If something's really a big problem, you can ask for an emergency meeting. I don't know that there's any legal definition of an emergency meeting, but if it's a real problem, they will probably try to schedule the meeting sooner than 30 days, but 30 days is the legal requirement. And then at each annual IEP meeting, it is required that the IEP team discuss whether behavior is interfering with the student him or herself, or that of others. And there's a particular page in the IEP document that is called the special factors page, and there's a question on it. We'll look at that page. I don't know if this is big enough for you to read on your screen, depending on how big your screen is, but and you'll see Sonoma County SELPA up at the top here. But these are the same forms generally used throughout the state. There's a statewide data management system for IEPs, and pretty much these forms are pretty much the same from county to county within California. And it asks a number of questions. And the important question for us today is, does the student's behavior impede learning of self or others? And this should be checked yes or no at each annual IEP meeting and on each annual IEP document. And then if the answer is yes, specify what kind of intervention strategies and supports are provided. And it's either a behavior goal or a behavior intervention plan that then is attached to the IEP. So if this is checked yes, one of these two things have to be checked. So I think David's then going to talk about levels of support.
Okay, so it's important when we talk about levels of support that we get the intervention that matches the severity and intensity and duration of the behavior. A problem is that if we're providing too much intervention for a child, then that doesn't give them the opportunity to be able to grow and to learn the behaviors they need to. So it's important that we don't overdo it. And so we look, first of all, at a goal only. We're going to talk about these in some detail coming up, and I'll just give you, these are the three levels that we're talking about. So behavior goal only is one level of intervention. It could be that we need a more formal and a more explicitly stated plan, and that's what the behavior intervention plan does. And then we also write a goal along with that. So there's always a goal, and then we may add a behavior intervention plan on top of that. And then depending on, again, the severity, intensity, and duration of the behavior, we may look at the highest level, which is a functional behavior assessment. And then again, there's a behavior intervention plan that flows from the FBA, and a goal that flows from the BIP as well. So Margaret's going to talk now about goals.
So behavior goals. As in other IEP goals, a behavior goal is like other IEP goals. You have to start with a baseline of the current level. You have to have some data about what's going on currently. And then the goal should be written so that you can form a picture of what doing or not doing at the present time, and what you expect them to be doing or not doing a year from now. The focus of the goal may be to reduce the problem behavior, It may be to increase the alternate behavior, or it may be focused on developing new skills that remove the need for the problem behavior. And this, would be an example would be if a child is having behaviors that result from anxiety, if they are taught coping skills that enable them to deal with their anxiety, then they may not have to engage in whatever the problem behavior is. So again, like all goals in an IEP, and I think I mentioned, but if I didn't, all of the goals should be written for a 1-year period, starting from the time of the meeting, and then a year from now, what we expect the child to be able to do in a year. And like all goals, they should be specific, measurable. You use the term achievable in this graphic, but actionable, attainable, any of those words um, are reasonable to include under A. Relevant, also realistic, and time bound or time sensitive. That is, the time, as we said, generally is a year in an IEP goal. One of the things that is most important when we look at goals, and in behavior goals particularly, is that it's measurable. It's not just whether we think behavior has improved, what can we actually measure and demonstrate? So what if the behavior goal is not enough? And I believe David's going to talk about that a little bit.
So if a behavior goal is not enough, then we need to look at the more formal reactions to a behavior. And those were what we mentioned before as being behavior plans and a functional behavior analysis. And we're going to talk about those here and give you a little bit of a definition of what that is. But one thing about if the goal is not enough, it is best to allow a good amount of time before discussing its effectiveness with your IEP team. So it does take a while for school staff to get up to speed sometimes with a behavior goal. Sometimes there's training required that a behaviorist or a school psychologist may have to provide to classroom staff, particularly in the general education setting. And also it just takes time for the whole thing kind of settle and to see how effective a goal is. So again, we don't want to intervene at a higher level than we need to. So it is a good idea to let the process work through itself, unless of course a behavior is dangerous or very disrupting. So based on the severity of the needs of the student, and there may be a lot of triggers that go along with the behavior. So the team may recommend, or the parent can request in writing, a behaviorist or a school psychologist perform a functional behavior assessment, which is the next step above a behavior plan. And it also may be that the IEP team gets together and just writes the behavior plan based on the knowledge that they have. So a BIP, a definition of that would be that it's a program that intends to stop inappropriate behavior and to teach a socially appropriate behavior, which is a replacement behavior. And a socially appropriate behavior in a case of a school would be, what does a typical child act like in a classroom setting? It's not perfect behavior, it's the behavior that would be appropriate for whatever setting the child is in. So let's talk about, to give you, it's not a full definition, but it's a description of the process. So basically what it is, that it's an information gathering process, and it's to determine the function of an inappropriate behavior and to come up with a replacement behavior. And the difference between an FBA and a BIP is that an FBA uses a more scientifically validated approach to collecting data and determining both the function of the replacement behavior. So, if the IEP team has clarity around the problem behavior, then we really don't need a functional behavior assessment. But a lot of times the function of the behavior is not going to be clear. We're not going to be able to figure out exactly what's going on, what the child is trying to communicate with us. So at that point, we may decide on an FBA. And an FBA may be performed before you change a placement. And I'll give you an example of that. Let's say a student is a recommendation for expulsion came up, that it's a very serious behavior and maybe there was an injury or violence or something took place. And so in that case, a process called a manifestation determination is performed. And the purpose of that is to determine if the behavior that was displayed is a manifestation, is a result of the disability or not a result of the child's disability. So it can be quite formal at this time, because we don't want to make a change of placement just based on a behavior. We have to know what the purpose of it is before we can do that. Okay, and then Margaret, I think it goes back to you.
Okay. So what is a BIP? That's the next question. So the first thing to think about is a BIP is part of your child's IEP. If your child needs a BIP, it does become part of the IEP, and therefore it's the subject of the law we've talked about in previous trainings, the IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And there's a couple concepts within that we need to remember. Remember the concept of FAPE, which is free, appropriate public education, and least restrictive environment. So the behavior plan should be designed so that the child is provided with free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. So those are important terms. And just like David was talking previously about, what happens if there's a suggestion for a change of placement, either through, the suggestion of expulsion, or just the IEP team says, we think your child needs to be educated in a different school or a different school setting. The question of what's least restrictive will come up with regard to behavior as well as other services provided in the IEP. You don't want to change a child to a more restrictive environment if supports can be provided that keep the child in the least restrictive environment. So those concepts apply to behavior plans as well as to the rest of the IEP. So, of course, as part of an IEP, you're used to seeing a bunch of forms and a bunch of paperwork. And there is a form for a BIP. And this is an example of what the form might look like. We're not going to go through the form particularly in this training, but just know that, there's a couple page form that's going to be filled out that documents everything in the plan. It may end up being many more pages when they actually fill out all these boxes, but that's basically what it looks like. So basically, what is a behavior plan? It's a supplementary support for a student in the least restrictive environment based on the individual needs of a student in a specific environment. And that last point is important. Sometimes, if your child is in a special day class or in a specialized school, they might say to you, well, and I've heard this many times, your child doesn't need a BIP because they're in an environment that has a specific structure around behavior. But the individualized education program and the BIP is to be based on the individual needs of your child, not the general needs of the other children in the class. And it does refer to the specific environment. If a BIP was written for your child in general education and then they're moved to a special day class, the environment has changed. So it needs to be based on both the individual needs of your child and the specific environment where they are. It's a plan for the school staff to change the environment, teach new skills, and reinforce positive skills. So all of those points are important. The school can change the environment, and then it's not just a change in placement, but to change the environment that they're in by the way people behave around your child, what's provided in terms of organization of the classroom and that sort of thing. So the environment can be changed. The child can be taught new skills, and when the child exhibits the appropriate behavior, that can be reinforced. And the whole purpose of this is to prevent the negative behaviors from getting in the way of learning. This is all about school and learning. So it has to be a behavior that's getting in the way of learning, and the point of the plan is to prevent behaviors from getting in the way of learning. So I think at this point, David's going to talk a little bit about key concepts of the BIP.
Okay, thanks, Margaret. So let's talk about the specifics that go into it and a few of the background things that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about BIPs. So one of the key concepts of a behavior plan is that they're positive, not punitive. And we're going on to the next slide there. An important part of this, and it's not just a philosophy that things, oh no, the one before, I'm sorry, Erica, up to 25. So the behavior plan is positive, not punitive, and that's just not a theory or a nice way of thinking about things. It's based on the scientific fact that punishment does not work, because what punishment does is basically reinforce the behavior that we don't want to see, because the power structure between the student and their environment becomes very one-sided, where the environment, be it a teacher or the classroom structure or whatever, is taking that control of the student. So the student has no way that they can then display the appropriate behaviors in a way that they can internally feel it. And so their environment's being controlled for them. So that's the reason that we keep these positive and not punitive. Again, it's not just a nice slogan. It's a real scientific fact that it's the only way that works. So another key concept of this is that the BIP is positive. The child has a problem, and this creates concern, empathy, support, and help. It evens out the power relationship between the environment and the child. It allows the child to take control of their environment because they now have a responsibility to help create the environment they're in. And if the adult is working with the child and not against the child, that then, as we said, creates the empathy, the support, and the help, instead of that person having to take power or control over the child. A negative way of looking at this is that the child is a problem. And this creates punishment, ultimatums, anger, and threats. And that all comes under the heading of coercion, which is not only a negative way to treat a child, it's very antithetical to the idea of creating an environment where a child can actually learn how to behave instead of being told how to behave. Okay. And then behavior plans focus on support, not management. And again, that's going back to the idea that this is a collaborative enterprise between the child and the adults that are working with the child. The ultimate ideal in this is that we're teaching the child independent skills by being able to take what they've learned in a controlled environment like a classroom where it's being taught, and they can apply that to other circumstances. It's generalizing that skill to a larger environment. So the behavior plan then focuses on the function of the behavior, not consequences. So the behavior, all behaviors have a communicative function. They're not there just because they're there. There's almost always a reason for a behavior. So if you're only applying consequences and not dealing with what the function of the behavior is, then you're just not getting to the root of what the behavior is, and no change will take place. And then the last one is that we're teaching and not controlling. So we're talking about the idea of being behavior as is any other skill that a child is learning in a classroom environment. They have to be explicitly taught math and language arts and science and all those other subjects. Behaviors are the same way. If a child doesn't have that intrinsic idea or those social skills to be able to behave in a way that's socially appropriate, we're not looking at that as something we have to control. We're looking at that as something that this child doesn't know. And so we have to provide explicit instruction on how the child can then learn those skills that they need to learn. And then the next one is that behaviors occur in a context. Classroom environment, what is the classroom environment like? Are there things that are happening in the environment? Uh, is there teaching going on that may be difficult for the child to understand? A vast majority of our children with special needs have language processing deficits, which means that they have either a delay or difficulties in some way in taking input from their environment, processing it in their brain, and then producing an outcome. So if you look for an example of a child that has a delay in language processing, and a teacher's asking a question about an academic subject, and the child is still processing that language, and he or she doesn't have the ability to raise their hand and answer a question because their processing is too slow, but they know this stuff, they can get it, then we have to look at how is that environment creating that behavior because they're not able to participate fully. Is the curriculum being delivered in an appropriate way? Many times our children may have auditory deficits or visual deficits. Again, that processing delay or processing difference. Is the curriculum being um, explained in a way that meets those processing differences? A child that can't take notes in a classroom because they may have visual processing deficits. Do we have a note taker for them so they're able to access or able to listen to what's going on in the classroom and not have to worry about doing two things at one time? I'll give you just a very brief example of that. In the way the brain works is that we have two ways of processing information. And one of those is that it's automatic. It's like driving a car, and we can go along in a clear and sunny day driving a car, and there's not an issue with us processing the information. But if all of a sudden it starts to rain and we're having to really concentrate on our driving, then that becomes a whole different thing. Those are called cognitive times that we're having to process something. And children with special needs oftentimes have problems in processing two cognitive tasks at one time, which is the example of note taking. So is the curriculum being presented in a way that the child can understand it? And are the people around the child interacting with that child in a way that encourages an appropriate behavior instead of discourages? And we've talked about that before in the time that we're talking about aversion, which is punishment or control in the classroom. Okay, so another key concept is our behaviors occurring in response to ecological events such as medication, fatigue. How many of those of you with children with special needs, those kids don't sleep well? That's a very common thing for children with disabilities, is having difficulty with sleep patterns. So is the child tired? Are they sick? Is there some internal or external stimuli going on that they're having a difficult time processing? Another thing we should talk about are those behaviors that are neurologically or genetically based, like Prader-Willi syndrome. That's the genetic disorder where a child doesn't have the ability to feel food sated or they're always hungry. And so is there something going on biologically with that child and neurologically with that child that doesn't allow them to behave in such a way that's appropriate? So we have to change their environment. Okay. And then the last in this section this is by Diana Browning Wright, who is really kind of the godmother, I guess, of positive behavior support training really in California. And she has a quote that a behavior will not be effective or behavior plan will not be effective unless it addresses the environmental factors which are contributing to the problem behavior. So we're not just looking at the child and this is how they're behaving. We're looking at what's happening in the environment that can be triggering or even causing a behavior to occur. That if we can change the environment, maybe the behavior will be addressed in that way. But at least if we can control the environment in a way that encourages appropriate behaviors, then we're taking a big step in the right direction.
So now we go on to how do you create the BIP? The first step is to think about what you know about the child. And it's very important that the IEP team knows what's going on with the child in terms of where they are in their current development, what they can and can't do at the current time in terms of behavior and other skills, what the impact of the child's disability is, and more about the child's personality, temperament, and interests. So you need to know these things in order to write a good BIP. And remember that you, as a member of the IEP team, have important information to share. Your observations and your knowledge of your child should go into this discussion of what we know about the child before we start developing the plan. Now, within the behavior intervention plan, there's some discrete sections, and we'll talk about each of these a little bit. The first is identification. What is the behavior we're talking about, how to prevent it, what alternatives or replacement behaviors there are, and then how to respond, how to react to the child's behavior. It also includes information on what changes are going to be made to the environment, strategies to teach the desired behavior, what reinforcements or rewards are going to be provided when the desired behavior is exhibited, what to do if the negative behavior occurs again, which likely it will, and how the school and parents and other teachers involved with the child are going to communicate about the plan. So the first step in this is identification. We gave some examples of problem behavior, any behavior that gets in the way of the learning for the child or other students. And with that, I want to point out that sometimes schools will say, well, the child isn't disruptive, therefore they don't need a behavior plan. But there could be a need, even if the child shuts down and just puts their head on their desk and can't absorb what's going on because they're overwhelmed. That's a behavior that's getting in the way of their learning. They're not disrupting other kids. They're not, putting demands on the teacher at that point, but it is affecting their learning. You could also say this about a child with ADHD who loses their homework and never turns it in. There are things that the school might not say are problems to them, but they're a problem to the child. So, if your child is doing things that is getting in the way of behavior, um, don't hesitate to identify that to the school. The description of the behavior in the BIP should be very clear. It should be as if a camera took a picture. You always say a picture is worth 1,000 words. You shouldn't need 1,000 words, but you should be able to give a clear description so that a stranger can read those words and be able to go to the classroom and see the behavior and know what student you're talking about. It should be something that's observable. Obviously, you have to be able to see what's going on, and should be non-judgmental. We're not labeling the child good or bad or anything like that. It's just what is the behavior that's going on that's causing an issue. When we talk about identification and a specific description, there are times that we have to think about how often does this occur? Is it once a week, once an hour? This is a very important thing. How intense is it? Is the child, when the child's having a meltdown, is it, they yell? Is it they throw things? What's going on? How intense is this behavior? And then how long does it last? So all of this data should be measured so that we can actually measure whether progress is being made when we put interventions into place. It's important in terms of identifying the behavior that we determine what triggers the behavior. Is it the way people around the child are behaving? Is there something about the place? Are the lights too bright? Does it smell funny? What's going on? Is it too noisy? What time of day? Sometimes a child can't deal with the entire school day. They get too exhausted before the end of the day, and so they may have trouble towards the end of the day. Other children have trouble adjusting as they come into school. So, when is this happening? Are there certain objects that trigger? Is the instruction too difficult, or is it boring? Um, the schedule, you're changing what the activities during the day. Sometimes transitions are a real problem. And, the physical or emotional state of the child. Is this child getting overwhelmed? Are they tired? What else is going on? All of these things can be triggers for the problem behavior. And so uh, they should be identified. And again, I think we've mentioned, if it can't be determined just from the classroom observations of the teacher and the other professionals who normally are with the child, then that's when you might need an FBA to delve into what those triggers are. And again, from our quote from Diana Browning Wright, a behavior plan will not be effective unless it addresses the environmental factors that are contributing to the problem behavior. And now we're going to move on to prevention, and I think David's going to talk about that a little bit.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Okay, so let's talk about prevention first with the behavior plan. And so, what is present or missing in the environment? Are there things going on in the environment that that are missing? Is there a prompt that's needed for the child to get started with an assignment? Is there some sort of punishment going on in the classroom where the child is not able to act appropriately, and they're being punished? So what could prevent this behavior? Can we make a change in the environment? Can we make it so that a child that's having trouble attending is given some prompts that allows them to then pay attention? It could be just a matter of a teacher checking for understanding with the child and asking questions. So what in the environment contributes to a student's problem behavior? Is there too much noise? And Margaret talked about some of these factors before: the lighting too bright, or is it too dark? Is there too much noise? Is there activities going on where the child can become distracted? So what is needed to change the behavior? So sometimes changes, structures, and supports in the environment. And these things could include time. And we talked about the problem with language processing. Does a child need a few extra seconds in order to process the language? Space. Do they need to be in a particular place in the classroom, either maybe near the teacher so they could pay attention better, or in an area where there's less distraction? Is there a place that child can go if they're feeling overwhelmed? So it's the idea of what can we do in the environment to change just how they feel there. What materials are being presented? It could be there has been some evidence, and it's a little bit controversial, but there's some evidence that the change in color or color overlays on certain information helps a child with language processing attend to written material better. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at how materials are presented and in what form. Is a child better as an auditory, as a listener? And so can they be provided with books on tape and they're able to listen to textbooks instead of having to read them? And then what do the interactions look like? Are there positive interactions going on? Is it an environment where if a child needs a more gentle approach, is there a teacher that can come to that level and interact with that child in a different way? What are the interactions with the other kids? Is there a positive environment in the classroom? There's a movement these days called Positive Behavior Intervention and Support, which is a school-wide program that teaches positive behavior support to the school, and the classrooms are set up to encourage those kind of positive interactions between children. So, what is the purpose of the behavior? So, we talked about before of a FBA. One of the intentions of it is that it gets to what's going on in terms of the purpose of the behavior, so that we can come up with a replacement behavior that meets that same need. And so, is the purpose of the behavior that the child is trying to get something? Do they need a tangible? Do they need something in their hand that they're feeling they have to get? Are they protesting or avoiding something? And, it could be that a child is uncomfortable in the classroom and they act out because they're just feeling that discomfort. And then we talked about this before, is the behavior a manifestation of the child's disability? So is the child with Prader-Willi that has an insatiable desire for food? We can't control that behavior. We need to modify the environment in order to allow that child to behave in a certain way. So there are those times when we have to make changes and not expect the child to make a change within themselves. Okay, so we're going to talk about alternative behaviors now. And so this section is where we're talking about replacement behaviors, those behaviors where we have identified what the function of the behavior is. And now we need to come up with a behavior that's socially appropriate, that meets the same need as the behavior that we're trying to get rid of. So a replacement behavior is one that is positive and meets the same function as the problem behavior. And this is critical because if we misidentify what the function of the behavior is, then we're going to misidentify a replacement behavior and there will be no change in the behavior. It's just not going to work. So how can the student escape, protest, or avoid to get his or her needs met in an acceptable way? And that's really the key to this, is that what we want to see is a child acting in a way that is socially appropriate in the setting that they're in. So if they're not raising their hand, are we able to teach them to raise their hand, but still get that same need possibly for attention that they're displaying by calling out in class? So it's really about teaching them that new skill so that they can generalize that skill into any environment that they're in. Okay, and this is Diana Browning Wright again. And so a behavior plan will not be effective unless it addresses development of a functionally equivalent behavior. Otherwise, the behavior will continue to occur. So Margaret mentioned before that in some behaviors, and I mentioned it in terms of Prader-Willi, that some behaviors are not modifiable. We cannot change the behavior. So Diana Browning Wright is saying that there has to be a functionally equivalent behavior. So how do we get around that conundrum? How do we get around that conflict? Well, what we talk about in a case like this is teaching skills where a child can stand their environment in such a way that they either don't have to display the behavior or the environment is changed in such a way that they don't have the trigger or the setting to display that behavior. So what we're trying to teach is resilience. And I've given the example before of a scientific beaker, the beakers that have the liquid in them. And for most of us, when we're starting out the day, that represents stress level, that beaker does, and the liquid inside is the level of stress. So most of us, our stress level is fairly low all the time, and we have quite a bit of room to add to our stress before we overflow. But a lot of our kids that are having these issues, their beaker is pretty full to begin with. So they're going to overflow pretty quickly. They're not going to have much room to take on additional stress. So by teaching coping skills, what we can do is to decrease the level of that initial liquid in that beaker so that they have more room in order to withstand the stresses that come with, with everyday living. Okay, so let's look at now effective reaction to behaviors. So let's see here. Okay, so the first part of that is what will reinforce the new behavior. So the new behavior must get a payoff as big or bigger than the problem behavior. Let me give you an example of that. It's a most common one I can think of is that a child that doesn't raise their hand in class and the teacher is sending the child to the principal because they talk out of turn and they're being annoying to everyone else in the classroom. Well, the payoff for that behavior that the child is getting by being sent to the principal is bigger than the payoff they're getting by either being ignored in the classroom or talked to in the classroom about not raising their hands. So you can see that what we don't want to do is to increase their behavior by reacting in a way that's more reinforcing than what we would normally do. So with a child that doesn't raise their hand in class, what is proven to increase the behavior? Well, I would guess calling on that child and making a plan maybe with that child to call on them more often. What does the student enjoy? So can we have a reaction to a reinforcement that will allow a child to get what they want, get that need met, and still act in an appropriate way? A reinforcer for a child that doesn't like to work on papers in the class, for instance. A reinforcer for that child might be that they get a few minutes to be able to escape that task. So we may not have them do those worksheets for a little while they're learning skills in order to allow them to work on those worksheets more effectively. What does the student say they want? One of the big things with the behavior plan that we need to keep in mind is that we have to have the child's input. So there are things called reinforcement surveys, for instance, which go through a list of categories and things that a student may like. And if they can choose what their own reinforcers are and how they're applied, then we're going to get better compliance from that child in the long run. Okay. And think of reinforcers as rewards. It could be for a child that wants attention. Praise could be a very powerful reinforcer for that child. Social status or recognition. Many times children with special needs don't have the social status, don't get the recognition just by the basis of their disability. And so providing them with that little extra recognition or an increase in social status can be a powerful reinforcer. Privileges. So if they're following the behavior plan, even if they're following part of the behavior plan and we're working up to them following the entire behavior plan, can we provide them with some additional privileges like if they want to get out of an assignment, can they go to the office and give a note to the principal or do something that allows them to have recognition for following their plan? Do they get tangible items? Is there something that you can give them in the way of tokens toward a reward, or maybe a stress ball or something that they have a physical thing in their hand that's a recognition of them doing well? Reinforcers may need to be changed if they no longer reinforce the desired behavior, and that's very true. Reinforcers have a tendency to get pretty stale pretty quickly. And if you really get it deep into some behavior plans, into some very complicated behavior plans, there may be even different levels of reinforcer depending on how the child is reacting to the behavior plan. So reinforcers need to be refreshed quite frequently. And again, working with the child on those reinforcers and getting their input into what they like and need is a good way to do that. So an effective reaction, what will be done if the challenging behavior continues or occurs? It is going to reoccur. And if you were at the last training, or I'll just mention that there's something called a behavior spike. And we see with most, if not all, it's certainly most behavior plans, is that we're going to see sometimes a pretty significant escalation of the behavior after a behavior plan has been implemented. And so we have to have a plan as how we're going to prevent the escalation. What do we do before the escalation gets to the point where a child's not able to control their reaction to it? So for an instance, somebody talked about self-injurious behavior. If a child is hitting themselves, how can we recognize that that's going to happen and intervene before that happens so that we can prevent the escalation? Does a child need to have a demand removed so that they don't escalate? What calms the student? Does going outside help? Does taking away the assignment help? Does is just a universe of things that we can do? But again, we have to have a plan about how we're going to do that and what's effective for the child. Should we have other agencies get involved? Does the child need mental health services, or are there outside behavioral services that would help? Is there a need to translate what's going on to school to the home? Is there something in the home that has to be added? And then how do we debrief the student afterwards? One of the problems when a child is escalating, and this is again a very common example that I use all the time, is think to yourself when you're driving on the freeway and you're driving along and everything is fine and someone cuts you off, and think viscerally about what happens to your thought process when that occurs. You probably notice that you either get cold or hot. Your thought processes slow down a lot of times. Your ability to think logically decreases pretty significantly during a time like that. Well, that's kind of a good analogy to the way our child is feeling when they're starting to escalate. The thought process becomes much more clouded, and their ability to be able to understand instructions becomes less effective. So we need to debrief with the student afterwards. What happened? What were you feeling when you started to get angry? What could have stopped that from happening? So not just send the student to the office. And this goes back to the old idea of punishment not being effective, because there's not any learning taking place. It's simply getting the student out of your hair for a minute. And but it's not doing the student any good. At an appropriate time, when the student's calm, then that's the time that a debriefing is very, very important. Okay, so emergency interventions. And so let's talk about those. Okay, so with emergency interventions, as a separate part of the behavior plan, many times there's something called a crisis plan. And this is usually written into the IEP, but sometimes it's an agreement between the team as to how a crisis is going to be handled. A crisis plan is not a substitute for a BIP. So the crisis plan is strictly for those times when the behavior plan has stopped working. We have no other choice, but we have to implement a crisis plan. I'll give you an example of something like this. A child has a tendency to get angry in a classroom and to throw things. So a crisis plan might include removing the other students from the classroom for a period of time while that student is able to calm down. It could include giving that student a prompt to go to another place in a pre-agreed to prompt that the student is understanding. And so even though they're not thinking clearly, they may understand a prompt and say, okay, this is the time when I can go outside and I can run around. I can run around the yard for a little while. So a crisis plan may be used to control behavior that is unpredictable and spontaneous. And so it could be that, we see those children, and it happens a lot of times with kids with special needs, that there may be an absolutely unpredictable behavior occurs. It may not have occurred in the past, or it may occur at a time that we're just not understanding is going to occur. And so what do we do when we get to that point? So restraint may be an option, only if a true emergency, but restraint isn't part of a BIP. I was a trainer for 10 years in crisis response because I worked in a school for children with emotional disturbances, and we were forced to do restraints occasionally. And fortunately, it was very occasional. But a restraint can't be an option that's written in any place. It can only happen if there's a true danger to the student, and it is danger of physical harm or self to others. And this does not include property damage, by the way. If a student, goes to the board and erases everything that's on the board, or is throwing things across the room, but no one's in danger of it, that is not a time that we can restrain a student. A restraint is only those times when a child is in an immediate danger, and it's a clear and present danger of serious physical harm to self or others. And I can tell you from experience that restraints are almost, I won't say never necessary, but they're necessary far fewer times than they have been conducted in schools. One of the things that I should mention with restraints is that restraints should never be prone restraints. In California, prone restraints are illegal. All restraints that are legal in California have to be standing restraints. And these are safe, and there have been very few injuries and no deaths that occurred from having standing restraints. However, kids do die, and it happens every year, and it's happened many times over the last 30 or 40 years, and earlier than that in the country, where children die of prone restraints. It's something called positional asphyxia, and it is an extremely dangerous thing. So I don't know if any of you have children that are in that situation where they've ever been restrained, but in California, prone restraints are absolutely illegal. Okay, and then parent or guardian must be notified within one school day if an emergency intervention is used, or if there is serious property damage. Usually what happens if there is a restraint, there should be an IEP meeting as soon as possible to discuss what has to change within the behavior plan, so that a reoccurrence of a restraint doesn't occur. Okay. And Margaret, with that, I think you are up.
Here. So typically, the BIP is written by a school psychologist or a behaviorist, someone who has been trained in behavior theory. But there will be input from the entire IEP team. It's quite possible that the school psychologist hasn't interacted with this child very much before they're called in to help write the IEP. And so they need to know what you and the teachers know about the child. So there should be, a team meeting and discussion by all the team members before the BIP is written. Don't forget that you have important observations, and you should share what you know, and don't think that anything that you know is irrelevant. You do have to remember that the team is not going to be particularly concerned about behaviors that are occurring at home that aren't occurring at school, even though there may be a relationship. We all have kids that sometimes would make it through the school day and then come home and have a complete meltdown. That's something certainly you want to discuss with your IEP team to, see whether you can reduce the stress level. But basically, you're talking here about behaviors that are going on at school. And so it's things that are observable by the school psychologist or behaviors that are going to be addressed, and they are going to be the ones that actually write the plan. Um, Once the plan is written, who's responsible for writing the plan? Um, well, it could be a school counselor, it could be a psychologist, it could be a behaviorist, it could be a teacher. Um, it's not the parent and it's not the student that's responsible. This is like every goal and other things in the IEP. It's up to the school to provide the supports, and so someone at the school should be named as the responsible party. I think it's important to point out, though, that while a particular individual, such as the school psychologist, might be indicated as the responsible person on the behavior intervention plan, if that plan is not understood by all the members of the team, all the people who work with your child, and they're not all on board, then this isn't going to work. If if a special day class teacher carries out the plan beautifully during the special day class sessions, and then when the child is in on the playground or at lunch or in art class, and the teachers are not implementing the behavior plan and still causing and triggering the behavior, this isn't going to work. So everyone who works with your child, all adults that work with your child at school, need to be on board with the behavior plan. What can you ask about in terms of thinking about who's responsible? You can ask at the IEP meeting, and it's always good to ask these questions. It gets things clarified. Who needs to be informed? And that may be everybody, including the custodian. Who needs to be informed about the plan? Um, how will staff who have to implement the plan be trained? And this can be a very important thing, because there may be uh, people on the staff who have never encountered the particular disability or the particular way a disability manifests itself as they do in your student. So they may need some training to just you know, understand the disability and understand how to implement the plan, how to actually carry out these positive behavior supports. How will you explain the plan to your child? The child should be involved. They should understand what the plan's about. And, perhaps this is going to be explained at school, but you all need to be on board. The parents and uh, the school need to be on board with how the child understands what's going on in the plan. Certainly, how to know whether the plan is working, what kind of data is being collected. Um, one of the things I've run into personally is that uh, people tend to remember what happened last week or yesterday. And so you may get, oh, yes, this is working, and actually look at data collected over a longer period of time. It may not be the case. Maybe yesterday or last week were a particularly good or bad time period, but what's really happening over time? You need data, and how is that data being collected? Um, and how will I know when reinforcers need to be changed? when will we see that they're not working and we need to do something different? All of those things are things that, as a member of the team, you can ask these clarifying questions. Um, Very important. How will staff and parent communicate, and how often will it occur? Uh, the communication ought to be fairly continuous, but what does that mean? Does it mean you'll get an email every day from the teacher? Does that mean you'll get a quarterly report, a progress report every quarter or trimester? It certainly shouldn't be the latter. There should be some system of communication set up so that you know what's going on, and all the staff who work with the child communicate with one another. And that should be documented in the plan. So at this point, we're going to go through a couple of scenarios and say, what would you do in this situation? So we have Kyle. Kyle's 10 years old, and he's the class clown, and he often blurts out inappropriate comments in the middle of class. He has ADHD and he has an IEP, but he's in the general education class. He goes to the resource room for academic support in math. The resource room teacher does not see the problem behavior, but the general education teacher sees it frequently and sends Kyle to the office just as frequently. His grades are starting to go down, and his mom is worried about his lack of learning. What should she do? And this might be a case where a behavior goal is sufficient. Um, in having that discussion, staff may be able to figure out, well, what is different about these two different situations? And it may, clearly a special day class or a resource room is going to have fewer kids. And so it's going to be, less noisy, less confusing, but also it may just be the way the teacher interacts with the child. And if they share information and they understand what's triggering the behavior, it may be that a behavior goal is going to be sufficient to deal with a situation like this. Let's talk about a different scenario. So Angie, 7 years old, has autism, has an IEP, and is in the general education class with support of a classroom aide. She enjoys being with her peers, and generally her day moves smoothly. She was doing an art project and having trouble opening her glue bottle. With the aide's assistance, Angie used her BIP calming strategies, including self-talk and social scripts for handling frustration. But despite this, she progressed into self-abuse, hitting her head against the wall. There are no current observable predictors for when she will be overwhelmed and when she will not. This is not the first time this has occurred, and staff report the incident to mom via their communication log. What should mom, we put mom in both these cases, mom or dad or whoever else is taking care of the child, what should they do in this situation?
Yeah, so I think with this, Margaret, if we don't have any input, that because of nobody knows what's happening, why this is happening. And so this is one of those times that I think it would be good to start a functional behavior analysis, because we have to get to the root of why the behavior is occurring. And it's going to be something based on something that is way before the child starts becoming self-injurious. And so is it an environmental issue? Is it a frustration issue? Is it for whatever reason the self-talk doesn't work that time? What's happening within the child that doesn't allow her to get over that with the strategy she has? So I think probably a more formal look at this would be a good idea in this case. Okay, so with what we've talked about today is that the behavior plan must clearly and specifically describe the behavior, the function of the behavior, and any environmental triggers. And as Margaret mentioned, it's important that this be like a photo, that this be an accurate description of really what's going on. The behavior plan must identify an alternative behavior which meets the same function as the original behavior, and include what the school will do to teach your child this new behavior. And as we talked about, explicit instruction is needed for a lot of kids in order to feel what that behavior looks like. Okay, so the behavior plan also includes what the school will do to change the environment to prevent the undesired behavior? Can something be done to change how instruction is given, or all those other things we talked about? Have a reinforcement for the new behavior and to keep those reinforcers new and to keep them fresh. Have a plan of handling a negative behavior before it occurs again. So if we see a child starting to escalate, we have a plan in place about how to interrupt that escalation before it becomes a problem. And the behavior plan must also be positive, not punitive. And we talked about the fact that punitive reactions to behavior actually reinforces the behavior we don't want to see. Have a corresponding IEP behavior goal. So we talked about the levels, that there be either a goal and a behavior plan and a goal, or an FBA behavior plan and a goal. It has to include communication with the IEP team, how often and what that communication is going to look like. And the behavior plan needs to be consistently utilized by all staff, not just written and left in a file. And this is something that, as a parent, you do need to be aware of, that does happen sometimes in some settings. And so if you feel that the IEP is not being implemented or utilized, that's something that you really need to bring up with your IEP team. We need to be sure the team monitors the effectiveness of the plan and goals. Is there data being taken? Is the data being taken, is it accurate, and is it timely? And if the plan and goals aren't resulting in positive change, request an IEP meeting in writing. Remember that those IEP meetings need to be held within 30 days, 30 calendar days of the time that you put your request in writing. Okay, and teamwork is always the key. We do emphasize working positively with your district if you possibly can. Behaviors are complex and emotions are emotional. So what we try to do is to become, try to be as calm and as cool and as analytical as you can when you're working with your team. In the long run, it's going to work better. That doesn't mean that you don't have a right to enforce your parental rights, but it can be done in a way that's not disagreeable. So we always encourage that. And much thanks in the presentation to Diana Browning-Wright and colleagues. Okay, Margaret.
So at this point, it's time to take stock of what you've learned, what additional resources you need, and what additional support you need. And we do encourage any of you to call our helpline. You can call us as many times as you want with as many questions you want. We do operate the helpline 9 to 2, Monday through Thursday. Often you'll have to leave a message and get a call back. If that happens, it's always good to tell us when is a good time to try to call you back. I know phone tag gets frustrating, but we do try to get back in touch with everybody who calls us that we can't pick up immediately. We just need to remind you again, we're parent advisors, not attorneys or advocates. We don't give legal advice. We don't tell you what you should do. We do try to provide you with options and supports and information. We can help you strategize, but in the end, it's your job to advocate for your child and to determine what is the best approach. Just to remind you that we are a federal parent training and information center, which essentially means we get some funding from the Office of Special Education, U.S. Department of Education, and we serve a whole bunch of counties that are listed here. There is a parent training and information center every place in the United States, and if you're trying to connect with the one in a different area and you don't know who that is, we can help direct you to the appropriate agency to get some one-on-one or more direct support. And so we're also a family resource center. That just means we get some support from the California Department of Developmental Services and the California Family Empowerment Center, and we get some money from the California Department of Education for that. We get all these different sources of funding, but they're generally not enough to actually support all the work we do. So we do rely on donations from people like you, and if you are so inclined, we accept gratefully all donations, and you can donate from our webpage, but Our services are free to you, and so don't feel obligated if that's not uh, possible, or if you don't want to.